The record shows, and what it reveals changes everything. On the second day of basic training, every American recruit is taught a rule they are expected to carry for life. We do not kill prisoners. We do not kill the wounded. We do not kill those who have surrendered. That is not guidance, and it is not optional. It is the law. It is the law of war, grounded in Geneva Convention principles that the United States has long claimed as a standard. It reaches back to President Lincoln and the Lieber Code in 1863, warning that anyone who kills an enemy wholly disabled shall suffer death if convicted. For more than 160 years, American troops have been told there are lines that do not move with politics. In World War I trenches, on Normandy beaches, in Vietnam's heat, and in Iraq and Afghanistan, generations were taught that some acts erase the difference between us and the enemy. You can debate a mission, you can argue a policy, but you do not cross certain lines and still call it honor. According to multiple accounts that later fueled a public dispute, September 2, 2025 became the day those lines were said to be tested from the very top. That day, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth was alleged to have issued a blunt directive: kill everybody. And after an American missile destroyed a boat in the Caribbean Sea, the story did not end with the first blast. As described by officials who said they reviewed the sequence, 2 survivors were later seen clinging to wreckage, shirtless, unarmed, and fighting the water as much as anything else. Then, about 40 minutes after the first strike, a second missile was fired at 2 men floating in the sea. If that description is accurate, it is not fog of war, it is not a split-second mistake, and it is not a chaotic exchange of fire. 40 minutes is time to reassess. 40 minutes is time to confirm what you are seeing. 40 minutes is time to consult the rules you claim to uphold. And 40 minutes is time to choose restraint or choose something else. Today, in a packed hearing room of the House Armed Services Committee, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett pressed the question millions had been forming in their own words. If this is not a war crime, then what is? If you served, if someone you love served, if you believe the uniform is more than fabric and thread, this is the kind of moment that forces a country to look at itself. Because what happened in September, as presented to the public, was not only a legal dispute, it was a moral one. And it carried the uncomfortable weight of being done in the name of the same people who were taught the rule on day 2. The hearing room was described as standing room only. Reporters lined the walls, cameras sat on tripods and shoulders, and microphones bristled like a metal thicket. This was not routine oversight, and everyone in the room appeared to know it. Pete Hegseth had resisted appearing for weeks, with lawyers raising privilege claims and national security arguments. But the pressure did not come from one party alone, and the demand for answers kept building. Even Republican members wanted clarity. Even Fox News hosts were said to be asking questions that did not fit a friendly script. Even the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, a Republican from Mississippi, publicly called for vigorous oversight. So, Pete Hegseth arrived, a former Fox News weekend host and former leader of a veterans organization who had left under financial scandal claims. And now he sat as Secretary of Defense, facing a line of questioning built to strip performance away and leave only responsibility. Across from him was Jasmine Crockett, a former public defender from Dallas, who had made a career of standing up to powerful men in rooms where power usually wins. The contrast was sharp. He carried the practiced confidence of someone used to controlling a camera and a frame. She carried preparation like a tool meant to pry open rehearsed answers. When Crockett opened her first folder, she did it slowly, letting silence do part of the work. She began by reading not a slogan and not a partisan headline, but a sentence from the Second Geneva Convention. Article 12. The wounded, sick, and shipwrecked shall be respected and protected in all circumstances. Then she looked up and held the phrase "in all circumstances" like a challenge that could not be joked away. In all circumstances means there are no carve-outs for suspects you have not proven guilty. In all circumstances means you do not get to write exceptions with a missile. Crockett then laid out the specific allegation that had ignited the hearing. On September 2, 2025, 2 men who survived the first missile strike were later killed in a second strike about 40 minutes afterward. Not 40 seconds, not 4 minutes, 40 minutes. She framed it as the opposite of confusion. She framed it as time to stop. She framed it as time to think. She framed it as time to choose the lawful path or to reject it. And then she asked for a direct answer, without detours, without speeches, and without slogans. If killing shipwrecked, unarmed survivors is not a war crime, then what would qualify? If you have ever wondered what accountability looks like when it finally reaches a powerful office, she suggested this was it. And if you believe the system never turns on the protected, she implied the record being created might outlast the protectors. She did not need theatrics, because the timeline itself was the point. By the time the hearing was gavelled to order at 10 a.m., the room was already leaning forward. By 10:15, Pete Hegseth was already sweating, according to the narrative that later circulated widely. Crockett did not shout. She did not wave her arms. She stacked facts the way prosecutors stack exhibits, calm, patient, and difficult to interrupt. "Let me establish the timeline," she said, and then she turned pages like a metronome. September 2, 2025, approximately 2:00 p.m. Eastern Time, a vessel in the Caribbean Sea is identified by U.S. surveillance as allegedly carrying drugs. You are in the Pentagon watching the feed. Is that correct? Pete Hegseth leaned toward the microphone and tried to widen the frame, saying he was monitoring multiple operations that day. Crockett tightened it again, asking whether he was watching this particular operation. After a pause, he said yes. "Good," Crockett said, and moved to the next hinge point. According to reporting from the Washington Post, later echoed by multiple sources described as inside the Pentagon, you gave a verbal order before the strike. Do you recall what that order was? Hegseth tried to pivot into a familiar attack on the outlet rather than the facts. Crockett cut the pivot off at the knees. She said she was not asking about an editorial board. She was asking about his words. He answered with a broad phrase about neutralizing the threat and destroying the vessel. She said that was not what she asked. Then she held up statements she said came from 3 separate sources present in the operations center, all describing the same line. Your exact words were, "Kill everybody," she said. And then she asked again if that was accurate. Behind him, lawyers scribbled and whispered, according to the account. He did not give the clean denial the room expected him to give if the claim was false. Instead, he offered context, talking about intent and mission parameters. Crockett pinned the move to the record. "So you are not denying you said kill everybody," she said. "You are trying to justify it." Heggs did not answer. Crockett turned slightly and told the chair to let the record reflect that he did not deny using those words. Then she moved to the next document like a hand sliding a chess piece forward. The first strike occurred at approximately 2:15 p.m., she said, and it killed 9 of the 11 people on board as described in the reporting and briefings. But the important part, she said, was what happened after. She described a surveillance drone still watching the water. She held up a photograph said to be from the feed, grainy, distant, and unmistakably human in what it implied. Debris, two small figures clinging to wreckage, two survivors doing one thing, trying to stay alive. According to lawmakers who said they viewed the footage, those men were shirtless and showed no visible weapons, no visible communications gear, no hostile gesture, just two bodies afloat, holding on to what they could. Then, at approximately 2:55 p.m., a second strike was ordered, and a second missile was fired at two men floating in the water. Who ordered that second strike, Mr. Secretary? Pete Hegseth tried to hand it off to Admiral Frank Bradley, commander of Special Operations Command, saying the admiral made the tactical decision. Crockett repeated the claim slowly, then asked the question behind it. Under whose authority? Following whose standing order? You cannot have it both ways, she said. Either Admiral Bradley acted alone, and you failed command authority over a major operation, or he was following your directive, and you are responsible for two unarmed, shipwrecked survivors being killed. Which is it? Hegseth defended the admiral as a hero and framed the moment as combat judgment. Crockett called it deflection. She reminded him that he was the Secretary of Defense, not a commentator grading someone else's decisions from a distance. She brought the focus back to command responsibility. She asked if he was telling the committee he had no knowledge of, no involvement in, and no responsibility for the second strike. Notes were passed behind him again, and he glanced back. He said he was not personally watching the feed at the moment of the second strike, because he had moved on to other meetings. How convenient, Crockett said, and the room reacted. She asked whether it was standard procedure to issue a kill order and then make sure you were not watching when it was carried out. The chairman called for order as murmurs rippled. Crockett steadied her tone and returned to the point she wanted written into history. She said she was not asking about viewing habits. She said she was asking about the obligations that attach to the person at the top. She said an order was given, and under that order, two unarmed survivors were killed. She said leaving the room does not erase responsibility, it underlines it. Then she stacked her documents again and said she wanted to talk about the men who died, because unlike the official posture in front of her, she believed their lives mattered. If you want me to continue in the same format, paste the next chunk you want included in Part 1, or tell me to continue from the next sentence after this point, and I'll keep the exact same structure and constraints. Crockett said there was a video the Secretary of Defense did not want the public to see, not because it revealed tactics, or exposed sources, or compromised a mission. She argued the real reason was simpler and more damning, because it showed exactly what the order produced when translated into action. Because it showed two human beings clinging to wreckage moments before a second missile erased them. She acknowledged she likely would not force the video into daylight that day. The administration, she said, had made its position clear. Just yesterday, Hegseth told reporters he would not release a top-secret, full, unedited video to the public. 2 weeks earlier, the president had said whatever they have, we would certainly release, no problem. Crockett said she did not need the footage to establish what mattered. She said she had something almost as powerful, the words of people who had seen it. She referenced Senator Mark Warner, who described the classified footage as very disturbing. She referenced Senator Angus King, who said that if the strike was intended to kill survivors, it would be a stone-cold war crime and also murder. She reminded the room that these were not fringe figures chasing attention. She framed them as lawmakers responding to what they said they watched with their own eyes. Then she widened it further, beyond party labels. She cited Representative Mike Turner, a Republican, calling the described action very serious and an illegal act. She cited Representative Don Bacon, a Republican and former Air Force Brigadier General, calling the reports a big concern. She called it bipartisan alarm, the kind that does not form unless something is deeply wrong. And she said the only people in the room who seemed unable to see what everyone else saw were the witness and the lawyers behind him. Hegseth tried to interrupt, suggesting the characterizations came from partial viewing and incomplete context. Crockett cut him off and said she had not yielded her time. She said he would get an opportunity to respond, but not before the facts were placed on the table. Then she returned to the photograph and made the moment personal without making it sentimental. She said the administration claimed the boat was carrying drugs, but claims are not evidence and labels are not verdicts. She said Senator Rand Paul, after a classified briefing, noted that the administration did not provide evidence that there were weapons on the targeted vessels. No proof of weapons, she said, only suspicion and assumption, and an official narrative demanding trust. She tapped the image again and asked the committee to pause on a basic human detail. 2 men survived the first missile strike. They stayed alive in a sea filled with debris, bodies, fire, and panic, and they still fought to breathe. She told the room to imagine what those minutes must have been like. Terror, confusion, injury, salt water, smoke, and the instinct to hold on. She said they found something to cling to and kept their heads above the surface. She said that is not ideology, that is biology, that is what any human does when the world tries to drown them. And then, she said, they looked up and saw the drone. Crockett described that detail as the cruelest part. The drone meant someone was watching. The drone meant the United States could see them clearly enough to target them again. The drone meant they might have believed, for a moment, that they would be rescued or at least left alone. She said many people across the world still believe America does not execute shipwrecked survivors. She said we do not know their names because the administration has not released them. We do not know if they had children, parents, siblings, or someone waiting for them to come home. We do not know their stories, their fears, their reasons for being on that boat. She said, we know only 2 things for certain in the public narrative as it stood. They survived the first strike, and they did not survive the second. Then she shifted from the legal to the human without softening her edge. She told Hegseth she was asking a question not as a lawyer and not as a congresswoman. She said she was asking as a human being. When you said kill everybody, she asked, did you think about them at all? Did you consider, even for a moment, that they were human beings, or were they only targets on a screen? Hegseth kept his face controlled and answered with a line about protecting American lives. Crockett said that was not what she asked. She said she asked whether their humanity registered with him in any meaningful way. She said his rehearsed focus on American lives, without acknowledging theirs, answered her question more clearly than any confession. Then she said the quiet part out loud, that this was not strength and not toughness, but a void where conscience should be. She told him that void disqualifies a person from command over service members who are expected to carry moral weight with discipline. She said it disqualifies a person from the highest defense office in the land. She said, the uniform is not supposed to be an excuse to do whatever you can do. It is supposed to be a commitment to do what you must do within the boundaries of law and humanity. And she said, that is exactly why the committee could not pretend this was just another news cycle. If anyone believed September 2nd was an isolated incident, Crockett said, they were not paying attention. She opened her next folder, thicker than the first two, and the paper inside looked like a pattern rather than a single episode. She said that since President Trump took office in January 2025, the administration had conducted more than 20 military strikes against vessels in the Caribbean Sea and the Eastern Pacific. She said more than 80 people had been killed. She repeated the number slowly, as if forcing the room to look at it without blinking. 80 people, she said. And we are supposed to accept that every one of them was a threat so immediate they deserved death without trial. She said the administration's language had grown comfortable with certainty. Narco-terrorists, she said, a phrase that can turn almost any suspected smuggler into an enemy combatant by definition. She argued that this kind of labeling is designed to end debate before it begins. And she said when the label becomes policy, bodies accumulate faster than answers. To underscore her point, she cited statistics from the Cato Institute about immigration enforcement, noting that 65% of people detained by ICE under this administration had no criminal convictions. She cited the Deportation Data Project, suggesting only 7% had violent convictions. She clarified those numbers were not specifically about the boat strikes, but about an approach to threat that casts suspicion as guilt. She said it is a wide net, and wide nets catch the wrong people, and wide nets do not care once they tighten. Then she returned to the strikes and said the committee was being asked to trust intelligence that could not be tested publicly. Hegseth said the intelligence supporting the operations was classified. Crockett called that convenient, and her tone sharpened again. She said, the evidence is always secret, the justification is always hidden, and the dead cannot cross-examine anyone. She said trust is not a substitute for proof. And she said oversight does not mean nodding along while officials invoke secrecy like a shield. Then she introduced a comparison meant to show that the September event, as alleged, was not inevitable. On October 6, 2025, she said, there was another operation, another boat, and another strike. She said there were survivors that time too. But unlike September 2nd, there was no second missile, no double tap, no 40-minute pause followed by an execution. She asked why. What changed between September 2nd and October 6th? Did you suddenly develop a conscience? She asked. Did someone finally explain the Geneva Convention in a way you could not wave away? Or did your lawyers decide that killing survivors might actually come with consequences? Hegseth answered that each operation is assessed on its own tactical merits. Crockett repeated the phrase and let the absurdity do the work. She asked what tactical threat is posed by two shirtless men clinging to debris in open ocean. What weapons did they have? What communications capability did they have? What imminent danger did they represent to the United States of America that justified a second missile? She said he could not answer because there was no answer that fit the facts. And she said that is why the timeline mattered, because it stripped away the easy defenses. She said there was only the order, kill everybody, and the question of how far that order was permitted to go. She said someone decided that everybody included shipwrecked survivors. She said someone decided that everybody included men who posed no visible threat. She said the committee was being asked to accept that decision as normal. And she said the country should refuse, because normalizing it would change the country in a way that does not reverse easily. Then she shifted to the administration's public messaging, arguing that the problem was not only the strike, but the story that followed. She described a pattern of shifting accounts, each version crafted to avoid ownership. First, it did not happen. Then it happened, but someone else did it. Then the witness did not see what happened, and then he endorsed the outcome he claimed not to control. She said truth should not change every few hours. She said the version of events should not depend on which camera is pointed at you. She said the public sees that kind of movement for what it is, not complexity and not nuance, but evasion. And she said the committee's job was to pin down the facts until they stopped sliding away. Hegseth tried to defend Admiral Bradley again as a hero making combat decisions. Crockett said heroism does not legalize an unlawful act. She said rank does not erase obligations. It increases them. She said the Secretary of Defense cannot outsource accountability the way a pundit outsources blame. And she said that if he wanted to argue that the decision was lawful, he needed to explain the law, not hide behind praise. At that point, the room was no longer watching a typical exchange. It felt, by her design, like a record being built for other rooms that might come later. A courtroom, a commission, a history book, a future hearing where the video is not optional and witnesses testify under oath with documents in hand. Crockett said the question that mattered was still sitting untouched at the center of everything. If two unarmed, shipwrecked survivors can be treated as targets, then the phrase "protected in all circumstances" becomes meaningless. If "kill everybody" can be interpreted as a no-quarter posture, then the line recruits learn on day 2 becomes theater. If secrecy can be used to avoid accountability, then oversight becomes a prop. And if the country accepts that, she said, it will not only be judging 2 men in the water, it will be judging itself. Crockett said the discussion could not stop at policy preferences or partisan defenses. She said it had to move to the law itself, not interpretations shaped for television, but the law as written and taught. She opened another binder, thicker than the last, and said this was the part many people try to avoid. Because once the law is placed on the table, rhetoric loses its power. And because the law does not care who holds office when it is violated. She returned to the Geneva Convention, repeating the phrase that had anchored the hearing from the start. The wounded, sick, and shipwrecked shall be respected and protected in all circumstances. She said those words were chosen deliberately, not accidentally. They were meant to remove discretion at the moment when fear or anger might override judgment. They exist precisely to stop leaders from convincing themselves that mercy is optional. Then she introduced another concept embedded in the laws of war: the prohibition on no-quarter orders, the explicit ban on declaring that no prisoners will be taken. She looked directly at Hegseth and asked what "kill everybody" meant, if not that. She asked how those words could be reconciled with any claim of lawful restraint. Hegseth attempted to shift the frame again, referencing operations against designated terrorist organizations. Crockett said she would get to that argument shortly. But first, she said, she wanted to anchor the conversation in American legal history, not foreign criticism. She held up an old document and described it as the Lieber Code of 1863. Issued by President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, it was the first formal codification of the laws of war by any nation. She read from Article 71, "Whoever intentionally inflicts additional wounds on an enemy already wholly disabled, or kills such an enemy, or orders or encourages soldiers to do so, shall suffer death if duly convicted." She let the word "death" hang in the room without embellishment. She said this was not written in an era of comfort or restraint, but during a civil war that tore the country apart. And even then, she said, leaders understood that killing the helpless crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She said the penalty was severe because the offense was severe. Not because the victim mattered more, but because the act corrupted the institution that allowed it. She said Lincoln understood something many modern officials pretend not to understand: that laws of war exist to protect the humanity of the people who follow them as much as the people they restrain. and that once you abandon those laws, you do not regain them by speech or apology. Then she brought the conversation into the present. She cited the Department of Defense Law of War Manual, the Secretary's own manual. She read sections forbidding refusal of quarter and forbidding killing enemies who have surrendered. She said the men in the water were not given an opportunity to surrender. They were not given an opportunity to be taken prisoner. They were not given any opportunity at all, because the order kill everybody foreclosed every other option. She said under the law, the obligation did not stop at not killing them. It extended to protecting them and, if applicable, rescuing them. And instead of rescue, a missile was launched. She asked Hegseth how that did not violate his own department's rules. She asked him how he reconciled that with the manual he was sworn to uphold. Lawyers behind him passed notes again, and he spoke carefully. He said the legal framework for the operations had been reviewed. Crockett interrupted before he could finish the sentence. "Reviewed by whom?" she asked. "By the military lawyers you dismissed. By the judge, advocate, general officers you sidelined or ignored. By advisors whose warnings you treated as obstacles rather than safeguards." She said rubber stamps are not legal review. They are paperwork. She held up another document. A statement from a group of retired military lawyers who had served across administrations and conflicts. She described them as people who had spent their careers applying the laws of war under real pressure. She read their conclusion carefully. If reports are accurate, the two survivors were rendered unable to continue their mission and were therefore protected persons. She said the statement explained that international law not only prohibited targeting them, it required the attacking force to protect and rescue them. She emphasized that word required. She said the conclusion was blunt and left no middle ground. Violations of these obligations are war crimes, murder, or both. She looked at Hegseth and asked whether he understood what that meant. There was no spectrum of acceptable explanations, no gray zone that turned missiles into misunderstandings. Either the law was followed or it was broken. And according to every expert cited, it was broken. Hegseth responded by saying those individuals did not speak for the Department of Defense. Crockett said they spoke for the law. She said they spoke for the traditions that American service members are taught from their first days in uniform. She said they spoke for soldiers who are expected to refuse unlawful orders even at personal risk. And she said the irony was impossible to ignore. She said the people most endangered by illegal orders are not politicians in offices. They are the service members who carry out commands and live with the consequences. She said those service members are trained that following orders is not a defense when the order is unlawful. She said that principle is taught precisely, so responsibility does not collapse downward onto the least powerful. And she said the Secretary of Defense should know that better than anyone. Then she turned to Hegseth personally. She said he had never commanded troops in combat at scale. She said his experience had been inflated over time to fit a narrative. She said he obtained his position through loyalty and media presence, not through operational command. And she said issuing kill orders from the Pentagon without understanding their weight was reckless beyond words. The gallery stirred, but the chairman did not interrupt. Crockett pressed on. She said senators and representatives from both parties were now using the same language. War crime, murder, illegal act. She said legal scholars across ideological lines were raising alarms. She said retired officers were expressing horror. She said veterans who had followed the rules under fire were asking why those rules no longer mattered at the top. She said when everyone who understands the law reaches the same conclusion, denial becomes indefensible. And she asked Hegseth what he knew that all of them did not. She suggested an answer herself, that he believed the law did not apply to him because he was protected by the president, protected by political loyalty, protected by the assumption that accountability stops at the office door. She leaned forward and said something that cut through the room. The President of the United States cannot authorize war crimes. There is no executive order that turns murder into policy. There is no statement, no rally speech, no social media post that overrides international law. The law remains the law, regardless of who occupies the Oval Office. She said that was not her opinion. It was the foundation of the post-World War II order that the United States helped build. It was the principle invoked when American prosecutors judged others. It was the standard America demanded when holding foreign leaders accountable. And she said abandoning it now would not be strength, it would be hypocrisy. At that point, the hearing had moved beyond whether something might have gone wrong. It was about whether the country would apply the same standards inward that it applied outward. It was about whether power could redefine legality. And it was about whether the words "kill everybody" could ever coexist with the laws America claims to uphold. Crockett closed that round by saying the law had been placed on the record. The expert opinions had been placed on the record. The contradictions had been placed on the record. And no amount of deflection could erase them once written. She said the next question was not whether the law had been violated, but what would be done about it. Crockett said there is an old rule in Washington that applies no matter how powerful the office. It is not the act itself that ultimately destroys a career, she said. It is the attempt to hide it. She opened another folder and said this part of the record was about transparency, or rather the lack of it. She said what followed September 2nd mattered almost as much as what happened that day. Because the response tells you whether an administration believes it acted lawfully or fears what the truth would show. She began with a public statement made by the President on December 3, 2025. Asked whether the video of the strike would be released, he said whatever they have, they would certainly release it. No problem. Crockett said those words were clear and unambiguous. They created an expectation of openness. They suggested confidence rather than concern. Then she moved forward 2 weeks. On December 16, 2025, Hegseth told reporters that, of course, the Department of Defense would not release a top-secret, full, unedited video to the public. She repeated the phrase, "of course," slowly, letting it echo. She asked the obvious question: what changed? Hegseth said the president was not fully briefed on the classification status of the video. Crockett repeated his answer back to him, incredulous but controlled. She asked if he was really telling the committee that the commander-in-chief was not fully briefed on a strike that had triggered international concern and bipartisan outrage. She asked whether ignorance was now the official explanation, and she said that explanation raised more questions than it answered. She offered an alternative explanation. She said the president likely did not know what was on the video when he spoke. She said someone showed him later. Someone showed him 2 unarmed men clinging to debris. Someone showed him the second missile. And that was the moment when release, no problem, quietly became of course not. She said that was not classification. That was damage control. She said classification exists to protect national security, not political security. She said hiding evidence because it is embarrassing or incriminating is not policy. It is a cover-up. And she said the committee needed to name it honestly. Then she turned to the shifting public explanations offered since the story broke. She laid out a timeline, reading it slowly. First, the reports were dismissed as fake news. Then the administration acknowledged a second strike but said it was ordered by Admiral Bradley within his authority. Then, Hegseth said he did not personally see survivors because of the fog of war. Later that same day, she said, he publicly stated that he stood by Admiral Bradley and his combat decisions. She looked up from her notes and asked how those statements fit together. She asked whether the truth was changing or whether the story was. She asked whether accountability was being passed around like a hot object no one wanted to hold. And she said, contradictions do not appear by accident. Hegseth attempted to say there was no contradiction. Crockett cut him off and said there was nothing but contradiction. She said each version was crafted to avoid personal responsibility. First deny, then deflect, then distance. She said this pattern was familiar to anyone who had watched scandals unfold before. She said innocent actions do not require this much explanation. They do not require this many revisions. They do not require attacking critics rather than answering questions. And they do not require hiding evidence that could supposedly clear your name. Then she introduced a new element that shifted the room again. She said the Department of Defense had opened a review into Senator Mark Kelly, a decorated Navy combat pilot, a veteran of multiple deployments, a man widely respected across party lines for his service. She said Senator Kelly had released a video reminding service members of something they are taught early, that they have a duty to refuse unlawful orders, that following an illegal command does not shield them from responsibility, that conscience is not optional in uniform. Crockett said his message was consistent with military law and tradition. She said the response from the department was not engagement or clarification. It was intimidation. It was an attempt to suggest consequences for saying out loud what the law already requires. She said that reaction spoke volumes. Confident leaders do not threaten people for restating the rules. She said this was not the behavior of an administration secure in the legality of its conduct. It was the behavior of an administration trying to silence dissent. She said it looked less like leadership and more like fear. Fear that the wrong people were asking the right questions. Fear that the narrative was slipping out of control. She told the committee that cover-ups rarely succeed. Not in the long run. Too many people see too much. Too many records exist. Too many consciences eventually break. She said sources leak not because they hate their institutions, but because they love them, because they cannot reconcile what they witnessed with what they were taught, because silence becomes heavier than the risk of speaking. And she said every attempt to suppress the truth only guarantees it will surface later, louder and sharper. Crockett said the video that could supposedly vindicate the secretary remained hidden. The timeline that could clarify responsibility kept shifting. Critics who could be engaged were instead targeted. Each move, she said, pointed in the same direction. Not toward innocence, but toward panic. She said history is unforgiving to cover-ups. She said they collapse under their own weight. She said when the full record eventually emerges, as it always does, the delay only makes the reckoning worse. And she said the committee's role was not to protect reputations, but to preserve the truth. She closed that round by saying the story was no longer just about 2 missiles. It was about how a government reacts when confronted with evidence it cannot comfortably explain. It was about whether transparency is real or conditional. And it was about whether the public would accept secrecy as a substitute for accountability. She looked directly at Hegseth and said this part would matter later, even if it was dismissed now. Because when investigations expand, when witnesses testify, and when documents are compelled, the early attempts to hide become evidence themselves. She said every contradiction leaves a fingerprint, Every delay leaves a trail, and every effort to intimidate critics becomes part of the story that cannot be erased. The final round did not begin with an accusation. It began with silence. Crockett let the room sit inside everything that had already been said. 5 rounds of documents, timelines, contradictions, and law. 5 rounds of answers that bent but never held. Then she spoke again, quieter than before. She said she wanted to ask a question not about policy or secrecy or classification. She said she wanted to ask about responsibility. She asked Hegseth if he remembered an interview he gave in 2016. She asked if he remembered what he said about war crimes. She reminded him of his own words. She said he had stated clearly that there must be consequences for abject war crimes. She said he had insisted that unlawful orders cannot be followed. She said this was not a misquote or a smear. It was on video, in his own voice, before he held power. She held up her phone and said that man was still him. Same face, same confidence, same moral certainty. Only the position had changed. She asked him what changed between then and now. She asked if the law had changed. She asked if the Geneva Convention had expired. She asked if centuries of military principle had suddenly become obsolete, or if the difference was simply that now he was the one giving the order. She said people rarely imagine themselves as the villain in their own story. They imagine themselves as decisive, tough, and misunderstood. They imagine necessity where others see excess. They imagine strength where others see recklessness. And she said that is how lines get crossed without ever being acknowledged. She leaned forward and said, war crimes do not care about self-image. They are not defined by intent or rhetoric. They are defined by actions, by orders given, by lives taken when the law forbids it. She said ordering the killing of shipwrecked, unarmed survivors fits that definition, whether he accepted it or not, whether he understood it or not, whether he believed himself justified or not. She said history is not moved by excuses, it is moved by facts. Then she invoked a principle older than any of them, from the Nuremberg trials, the rejection of the defense that someone was just following orders, and the companion principle that matters even more here, that those who give the orders are more culpable, not less. She said the people who pressed the button did not create the policy. They did not frame the command. They did not sit in offices deciding what words like everybody would mean. She said responsibility travels upward, not downward. And she said that principle was created with American participation. She looked at him and said, he gave the order. He set the chain in motion. 2 men died as a result, and no amount of delegation or absence from the room changed that. She said, command responsibility does not evaporate when you stand up from a chair. Then she asked the question she had been building toward. Who pays for war crimes? She said when a soldier commits one in the field, they are court-martialed. They are imprisoned. They are dishonorably discharged. She asked what happens when the order comes from the top. What happens when the person responsible sits in the Pentagon? What happens when the president stands behind them? What happens when power shields itself from consequence? She said that was the real test of a system built on law. She said she believed Hegseth thought he would never pay, that he believed position and loyalty would protect him, that he believed the rules were for others, for enemies, for subordinates. She said the law does not work that way. It is patient. It keeps records. It waits longer than any news cycle. And it eventually collects. She said, maybe not today, maybe not this month, but someday, in some forum that cannot be controlled or delayed. He would have to answer for September 2nd, 2025. She said that was why the hearing mattered, even if nothing happened immediately. Because a record was being created. Because facts were being preserved. Because memory was being secured against denial. And because history does not rely on press releases, she said the names of the men killed might never be known. But what happened to them would not disappear. Because once something is written into the public record, it does not vanish. It waits, like the law itself. She stood and gathered her folders. She said Hegseth would leave the room and return to his office. She said he would tell himself that nothing had changed, that he survived, that power still protected him. Then she shook her head. She said something had changed. She said millions had watched. Millions had heard the evidence. And millions now knew what the order meant. She said he would carry that knowledge with him, in every introduction, in every photograph, in every mirror. Because once the public sees something clearly, it does not unsee it. She said when people ask who pays for war crimes, the answer is never simple. Soldiers pay with their consciences. Leaders pay with their legacies. And nations pay with their moral standing. She said the only question was, how much more would be paid before accountability arrived? Then she turned and walked out. Behind her, the room stayed silent. The cameras were still. The lawyers said nothing. And Pete Hegseth sat alone at the table, with no answer left to give. There is a particular kind of confidence that forms in people who have never faced lasting consequences. It grows quietly over time, reinforced by escapes that feel like victories. Mistakes fade without penalty. Scandals dissolve without reckoning. And eventually the absence of consequence begins to feel like entitlement. They move through the world as if protected by an invisible barrier. Rules apply to others. Scrutiny is something to be managed, not endured. Failure is temporary, never final. And accountability is something that happens to weaker people. For most of his adult life, Pete Hegseth had lived inside that bubble. Personal failures did not stick. Professional controversies did not follow him. Each time he should have been stopped, something intervened. A connection, a pivot, a media platform willing to move on. Marriages ended, and life went on. Financial scandals surfaced, and then faded. Allegations appeared, were argued, and then buried under noise. Each narrow escape reinforced the same lesson, that he was untouchable. So when he walked into the hearing room that morning, he did not expect disaster. He expected another storm he could ride out. Another cycle he could survive. Another performance where confidence would substitute for answers. He had done it before. He walked out with the same outward posture, a practiced smile, a steady stride, a motorcade waiting outside. On the surface, nothing appeared different. But something had shifted beneath the performance. The calls that once came quickly would begin to slow. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just enough to be noticed. A message unanswered. A meeting postponed. A conversation shortened. Then quietly removed from the calendar. This is how distance begins in Washington. The president would not turn immediately. Loyalty, when it is loud, takes time to fade. Public support would remain firm for a while, but warmth would cool. Access would narrow. Pete Hegseth had seen this pattern before. He had watched others fall out of favor the same way. Officials praised one day, dismissed the next. Support evaporating without warning or explanation. He believed himself immune. Fox News appearances would begin to feel different. Questions would sharpen. Language would soften around him, not in support, but in caution. Anchors would hedge instead of affirm. The network would protect itself first. Republicans who had defended him would start to recalibrate, not loudly, not together, but one by one. A comment withdrawn, a statement revised, a reporter's call unanswered. A sentence that once said full confidence now said concerns. This is how political gravity works. It pulls quietly, then suddenly. Veterans organizations would begin to speak, carefully at first, with language chosen to avoid open war. But the concern would be unmistakable. This is not what we were taught. Gold Star families would be harder to deflect. A mother speaking about a son who followed the rules. A widow asking why her spouse had to obey laws others ignored. Grief does not need talking points, and it does not accept procedural answers. Those voices would travel, across platforms, across borders, across generations of service members, and there would be no effective response. International reaction would follow its own path. Statements of concern, calls for independent review, questions from allies who had defended America before, unease replacing trust. The possibility of formal prosecution would remain remote. The obstacles were real. The politics were complex. But possibility alone changes behavior. It shadows travel. It limits invitations. It narrows options. It creates a quiet list of places that are safe and places that are not. It is a small club, and it is not a prestigious one. Then there were the quiet hours, the hours no press secretary manages, the hours when bravado has no audience, when memory is unfiltered, and when distraction no longer works. In those hours, the image returns. Two men in the water, clinging to debris, looking up at a machine that sees them, waiting. He had not thought of them that way before. They were abstractions, dots on a screen, threats by label, problems to be resolved. The hearing made them human. It made them specific. It made them unavoidable. It forced him to imagine their final moments. The second missile, the realization that rescue was not coming, the understanding that the watchers were not saviors. The final seconds before impact. No answer exists for that moment. Only silence. Some people can live with that silence. Some cannot. Compartmentalization is a skill. So is denial. But they crack under weight. The persona of toughness often hides fragility. The louder the performance, the thinner the shield. There is no burden heavier than unnecessary death. No rationalization that fully holds. No victory in avoiding conscience. Time would decide which kind of man he was. But history is not kind to those who mistake power for immunity. The bravado fades faster than the record. The office empties sooner than the memory. And legacy does not negotiate. Karma does not rush. It does not announce itself. It waits, patient and precise, collecting what is owed. The hearing room emptied quietly. Cameras were packed away. Reporters filed their stories. Spectators returned to their lives. But the record stayed behind. Pete Hegseth left with practiced composure. He smiled for the cameras. He shook hands. He entered his motorcade. Outwardly, nothing appeared broken. But support does not vanish all at once. It thins. It cools. Calls slow. Access narrows. White House loyalty is loud until it is not. Praise lasts until cost appears. Then silence replaces defense. Others had learned this lesson before him. He was not different. Media appearances would change in tone. Questions would sharpen. Language would grow cautious. Certainty would turn into distance. Protection would quietly retreat. Political allies would begin to drift. Not loudly, not together, but steadily. Each step small enough to deny. Veterans' voices would grow firmer. Gold Star families would speak without restraint. Grief would cut through spin. No talking point could answer it, and no denial could quiet it. International attention would continue to build. Statements of concern would multiply. Allies would ask uncomfortable questions. Trust would thin where it once held. Reputation does not rebound easily. Formal prosecution would remain uncertain. But possibility alone changes everything. Travel becomes complicated. Invitations become cautious. Freedom narrows quietly. And then there are the quiet hours. No advisors, no cameras, no performance, only memory. Two men in the water, clinging to debris, looking up, waiting, then understanding. The hearing made them real, not targets, not abstractions, human beings, frozen in a moment that cannot be undone. Kill everybody. 3 words, 1 order, 2 lives erased. A permanent record. No explanation restores what was lost. No framing removes responsibility. No silence rewrites history. Actions remain. Records endure. Years from now, this day will still appear. In biographies, in articles, in searches by people who never knew him. That is how legacy forms. Some reckonings are public. Some are private. Some are slow. But none are optional. And none are forgotten.